The Forgotten Temple. Have you ever dreamed of a place you've never been, but still you feel like you've lived there? For years he dreamed of the same temple, always the same broken ceiling, the same distant bells, and the same feeling that something was calling him. He thought it was just his imagination, until, on a journey with no destination in sight, he saw it. The temple existed, abandoned, forgotten, but waiting for him. And when he entered, he found an old painting on the wall, with your own face, but he was never there, or was it? If that already gave you goosebumps, imagine what he found inside. Like, subscribe to the channel and get ready to dive into a story that defies logic, and perhaps your own memory. For years, every night he dreamed of the same place. A temple hidden amidst a dense forest, covered in moss and ancient leaves. In the dream there was always a trail of broken stones, bells swinging even without wind, and decapitated statues watching in silence. The sensation that invaded his body was strangely familiar, not of fear, but of an inexplicable longing, as if he had been there before, as if that temple were more than just a dream, as if time were trying to remind him of something he had never experienced, or rather, something he couldn't remember experiencing. At first he ignored it, thinking it was just a figment of his tired mind. But the recurrence of details, the repetition of scenes, and the clarity of every corner of the temple made him a doubt. It was impossible to dream of such a place without ever having seen it. He began searching, studying ancient religious architecture, forgotten maps, and even explorers' journals. Nothing. The temple simply didn't exist anywhere in the known world. Until one day, on an unplanned trip into the interior of a foreign country, he got separated from a hiking group. And there, through the trees that seemed to whisper in the wind, he saw the familiar silhouette, cracked columns, weathered bells, and the statues, just like in dreams. The temple was real. Approaching it was like entering a home after a long time away. Each step seemed guided by an ancient memory. He knew where to step, where the altar was, where a hidden step lay. And most disturbing of all, everything there seemed to be waiting for him. The air was dense, as if time had stopped. Entering one of the most hidden chambers, he found a painting on the stone walls, almost completely deteriorated, but within it, his face. He, in priestly robes, holding an ancient symbol. It was impossible to deny. It was him, or someone who was him. In the days that followed, he could no longer escape the truth. The visions came in force, ancient rituals, chants in dead languages, a multitude of worshippers, and he leading it all. But amidst this spiritual grandeur, he also saw error. In one of the most intense visions, he saw himself breaking a pact, ending a ritual prematurely, leaving the temple in haste as a dark energy spread. A grave error. A spiritual betrayal that apparently sealed the fate of that place. He then understood that the dreams, the journey, the reunion with the temple, none of it was coincidence. It was a calling, a karmic cycle seeking reparation. The temple had fallen into ruins, a reflection of the imbalance he himself had left in another life. The only way to end it would be with a new ritual, this time a complete one. Guided by his memories, he gathered what little he could find and rekindled the ancient altar flame. As he recited the words that surfaced in his mind as if they had always been there, the bells rang on their own. The wind swirled and whispers cut through the silence. Something awakened, but it wasn't fear. It was liberation. The next morning, as he left the temple, he noticed it was no longer visible among the trees, as if it had faded. But within him, a new peace had settled. When he returned home, on his desk lay an anonymous letter, written in gold ink. Just one sentence: the cycle has been closed, but other portals still await. And that's how he understood. Some debts don't die with the body. They wait, in forgotten temples, in persistent dreams, or in mirrors that only reflect what the soul still needs to remember. For a long time, he tried to ignore those dreams. After all, who would pay attention to a nightly repetition of images of an ancient temple that didn't even seem to exist? But the frequency of the dreams increased. Always the same scene. A dense forest, the smell of incense in the air, the sound of bells echoing from somewhere unseen. And in the center, the temple, immense, covered in moss and cracks, with broken columns and statues that seemed to weep. He woke sweaty, confused, but with a feeling difficult to describe, a longing that didn't seem to be for this life. Driven by restlessness, he began researching. He rummaged through books on ancient architecture, forgotten religions, old maps of the region where he lived, but nothing. No building with those characteristics, no temple that matched the details. It was as if his mind had made it all up, but the feeling persisted. What if it wasn't an invention? What if it was a memory? Until, on an unplanned trip, everything changed. He had accepted a last-minute invitation from a friend to spend a few days in the countryside of another country, far from the city, technology and routine. A simple, peaceful place where time seemed to pass more slowly. Walking along a secluded trail with no specific destination, he saw it. He stopped in his tracks. There, between gigantic trees, the cracked roof loomed, nearly swallowed by the forest. His heart raced. The bells he'd heard in his dreams now rang in the distance. He had no doubts. It was the temple. For a moment, he thought he was daydreaming. He blinked several times and approached slowly. Every detail matched. The time-worn steps, the double doors with their embossed designs, the cracked pillars that seemed held together only by faith. It was exactly like in his dreams. Even the scent of incense was present, even though nothing was lit there. A shiver ran down his spine. As he crossed the rusty gate, something inside him trembled. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper, as if he'd returned home after centuries away. Each step echoed like a reunion. And then came the certainty. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a calling. The search, which until then had seemed pointless, now made perfect sense. The temple not only existed, it seemed to have waited for it. Dust covered every inch of the stone walls. Tree roots wove through the temple's cracks, as if the forest itself wanted to embrace or swallow this structure forgotten by time. But he knew. As soon as he looked at the moss-covered facade, his heart raced. It was there. The temple of his dreams, the same one that had accompanied him night after night, now before his eyes, hidden in the heart of a foreign forest. The ground creaked beneath his timid footsteps. The air was heavy, as if carrying the echo of ancient ceremonies. Broken bells still swayed in the wind, emitting soft, all too familiar noises. He couldn't understand how, but he already knew where the columns, the stairs, the altar were. Every corner seemed etched in his memory. The feeling was more than déjà vu. It was a reunion. He moved as if returning home after centuries. The temple wasn't just a dreamscape. It was a real place. And more than that, it seemed to be waiting for him, as if he were the last visitor, the one missing for something to be completed. A shiver ran down her spine as she passed through a rotting wooden door. The interior was in ruins, but a subtle energy vibrated in the air. It was as if time worked differently inside, denser, older. The shattered stained glass windows still let in beams of colored light, projecting them onto the floor in strange geometric shapes. In the center sat a dust-covered pedestal. He approached. He placed his hand on the stone, and for an instant felt the temperature of the room drop sharply, as if something invisible had just moved behind him. But he didn't turn around. He stood there, trying to figure out if the fear was his or the fear of the place. It was then that he noticed symbols engraved on the base of the altar. Circular lines, eyes, hands. Symbols he'd never consciously seen, but recognized immediately. They were the same ones he'd seen in his dreams, and now they were there, before him, concrete, He took a deep breath, trying to control the mixture of euphoria and dread. It was as if the answers were about to emerge from the floor, the walls, the very air. And perhaps they were. For at that very moment, the cracked bell above him shook loudly. Alone, the sound echoed through the temple like a call, a whisper from the past. And he knew, from that moment on, his life would never be the same. He stopped at the temple entrance, as if an invisible magnet were pulling him inside. The door, made of nearly petrified wood, was ajar. There was no sign of a lock, as if it had never been locked. He took a deep breath. A strong scent of wet earth and ancient incense hung in the air. As he crossed the threshold, a shiver ran down his spine. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper, a kind of silent recognition, as if his feet knew where to step before he even looked at the ground. The main hallway was lined with broken columns and worn tapestries, but nothing there seemed strange. To him, quite the opposite. His steps were automatic, guided by a memory he hadn't known he had. He turned left before even seeing the hallway. He climbed 3 steps that were partially covered in moss. And as he entered the central room, a thought struck him. The altar is still there, and it was. He looked around and noted the geometry of the space. Every detail seemed familiar. The slightly cracked dome on the ceiling, the stained glass windows half covered with dust, the precise position of the candles, now melted to the base. Nothing here was new. How could it be when he'd never been there before? Trying to understand his feelings, he approached an ancient mural at the back of the room. The figures depicted monks, rituals, and circle dances. But in the center of the image, a man in golden robes held a luminous device in his hands. And this man had his face. It was like a shock. He instinctively recoiled. His heart raced. Was he going crazy? Was it just a coincidence? But deep down, he knew. That image confirmed what his body had been telling him since the moment he'd walked through the entrance. That temple was his. Not in the present, but in some lost time, in some life beyond reach of logic. And then he realized something even stranger. As he walked to the back of the temple, where a small staircase led up, he felt his hands move on their own, as if they knew exactly where to touch the walls to activate a secret door. And they found it. With a faint click, one of the stones shifted, revealing a hidden passage. There, behind that wall, was a hidden room, small, circular, with symbols carved into the floor in patterns he couldn't translate, but understood intuitively. He knelt in the center of the circle and, without knowing why, began to murmur words in a forgotten language. The syllables flowed as if memorized centuries ago. The room vibrated slightly. A dense energy filled the space, and he knew in that moment that he had crossed a point of no return. He was back, and the temple knew it. The light filtering through the cracks in the ruined ceiling was dim, but enough to reveal the thick dust dancing in the air. The man, still in shock at recognizing every corner of that forgotten temple, advanced cautiously through stone corridors covered in moss and fragments of rotting wood. Each footstep echoed as if disturbing the silence of something that had slumbered for centuries. There was no doubt. He knew this place. His feet guided him without hesitation, as if an invisible map were revealing itself beneath his movements. He passed stone arches decorated with faded symbols, climbed a partially collapsed staircase, and reached a large circular hall in the heart of the temple. There, his hands began to tremble. On the opposite wall, partially hidden by cobwebs and cracks in the plaster, was a painting. Something made him feel that this was the true reason for his journey. Approaching, he pushed aside the dry branches and brushed away some of the dirt with his hands. Gradually, the image revealed itself. First the eyes, then the outline of the face, then the details that made him recoil, a chill running down his spine. The figure depicted in that ancient painting was him, but not as he saw himself in the mirror. There, he was depicted as a priest, wearing ceremonial robes that seemed part of an extinct culture, surrounded by esoteric symbols and lit candles, as if in the midst of a ritual. It was like looking at an ancient, version of himself. The strangest thing was the gaze of the painted figure. It wasn't static like the eyes of any ordinary portrait. It was as if there was something behind the paint, a dormant presence. For a moment, he had the sensation that the painting was breathing along with him, that it was watching him back, that it recognized him. Below the image, a faded inscription became legible with effort. It was written in a language he didn't consciously know, but which his mind seemed to translate clearly. "He who broke the bond will return to mend it." These words echoed in his mind like a bell, breaking the silence of time. He took a few steps back, trying to comprehend. The visions he'd had, the dreams, the feeling of familiarity, everything seemed to fit together around that painting. Somehow, it was more than a memory. It was a spiritual mirror, a call from a life that had left something unfinished. Heart racing and eyes fixed on the portrait, he felt his breathing change. It was as if the air around him had grown denser, more charged. And then, for a brief second, the flames painted on the candles in the image flickered, as if an invisible breeze had passed through them. The entire temple seemed to shake. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he was certain of one thing: the painting was the key. That image was the link between two times, two lives, two destinies, intertwined by a choice made long before this existence. And now he was there, to face the consequences. The temple was not just a dreamscape, it was an altar of ancestral memories, and his spiritual journey was just beginning. The days following the temple visit were anything but normal. The man began to experience sensations he could not explain. These were no ordinary dreams nor mere memories. They were visions complete with sounds, smells, and emotions that came like waves, pulling him back to that sacred place. In the wee hours of the morning, he would wake up sweating, with the clear image of being inside the temple again. But not the abandoned, overgrown temple he had visited. No, it was a living temple, with lit torches on the pillars, people walking silently through the passages, ritualistic chants echoing off the stone walls. In these visions, he wasn't just a spectator, it was as if he were living again, in another time, with another body. He walked the corridors confidently, gave orders, conducted ceremonies. He began to recognize details he hadn't even noticed during the royal visit. A coat of arms above the altar, a blindfolded statue, a cracked bell hanging from the center of the dome. In one of these visions, he found himself surrounded by people dressed in white, kneeling before him. He stood, holding a chalice of golden liquid. The words came automatically, in a language he didn't know but understood perfectly. He felt overwhelmed by a greater presence, as if he were merely a channel for something divine. As the days passed, his daily life began to blur with these memories. He would spend minutes in a trance, staring into space. He began writing strange symbols on scraps of paper, sketching the temple with surgical precision, and speaking unfamiliar words in a low voice, as if reciting forgotten mantras. One day, while looking in the mirror, he experienced the most powerful of manifestations. For a brief second, he saw not his ordinary reflection, but rather the painted face of the priest from the painting he had found on the temple wall. He wore the same ceremonial attire, his eyes glowing golden, and a faint, enigmatic smile. The image vanished in the blink of an eye, but the impact remained. He then understood that the temple wasn't just in ruins in the physical world. It still existed on another plane, and his spirit was connected to it by something beyond rational comprehension. The memory of that past life, of everything he had been and done, was returning because a spiritual issue needed to be resolved. The dreams became even more intense. He saw scenes of despair, the temple collapsing, priests running, something broken, a ritual interrupted, and at the center of it all, him, or at least his former self. He felt guilt pulsing through time, pulsing within him. It was as if the temple had called him back, not out of nostalgia or spiritual curiosity, but out of necessity. Something had been done, something had been forgotten, and now It was time to face whatever it was. That night, he slept for the first time with incense burning beside his bed. When he closed his eyes, he didn't have a dream. It was a reunion with everything he'd tried to ignore his entire life. And the temple, even destroyed on the physical plane, awaited him in its entirety elsewhere, more alive than ever. Since leaving the temple, something had changed in the way he perceived the world. Visions that had previously come only in dreams now manifested themselves in waking moments. Sounds of bells no one else heard, whispers in an ancient language echoing in seemingly silent places, and a constant feeling that he was being guided by an invisible force. But it was in the reflections of the mirrors that everything intensified. His face at times seemed to carry expressions he didn't recognize as his own. There was something else there, someone else. One night, as he fell asleep with one of the temple's ancient images in his hands, he was drawn into a dream more intense than any before. It was no ordinary dream. It was as if he were inside the memory of another man, a temple priest, dressed in golden robes and with troubled eyes. This man, who was himself in a past life, was walking through the temple's corridors in the midst of a ceremony, surrounded by other members of an ancient spiritual order. At the central altar, an invocation was being chanted, but something went wrong. The man interrupts the ritual, hesitates, and breaks a sacred vow, an oath of spiritual continuity between worlds. He decides to sever the bridge between the living and the ancestors, fearing the consequences that might arise from crossing the portal they were attempting to open. As a result, the temple is disconnected, the order is dissolved, and a silent curse is cast upon all who participated in that moment. When the protagonist awakens, the weight of the memory suffocates him. He finally understands that his entire current life is marked by the need to right that wrong. The temple didn't call him by chance. The connection is direct, personal and spiritual. He was the main conduit between two worlds, and by interrupting this flow, he triggered a series of imbalances that would affect future lives. He begins searching for ancient books on forgotten religions, karmic pacts, and spiritual lineages. In one of the texts, he finds a reference that chills him. He who closes the temple carries the silence of the soul, and only the sound of the bells will free him. From that moment on, he realizes that his mission is not just to visit the temple, but to reactivate a bridge that was broken. And more than that, he is being watched by the same spirits that once trusted him. During a deep meditation, he hears for the first time the voice of one of the temple's ancient masters. "You have left us in the dark, but you can still bring light. Now the journey takes on new weight. It's no longer about understanding the past, but about repairing what was destroyed. The spiritual debt is in your hands, and time to pay it off is running out." He returned from the temple with his soul in turmoil. The images he had seen in his visions haunted him. His face, the same as the one painted on the temple wall, appeared in dreams, wearing the ceremonial robes of an ancient priest, surrounded by an aura of power and responsibility, but also surrounded by error. In one of these visions, the man saw himself interrupting a ritual. The sacred flame went out, the bells fell silent, and the eyes of the temple statues wept blood. In his clearest vision, he broke a circle made of salt and gold, a sacred symbol of commitment between his people and the spiritual guardians of that temple. The reason? A gesture of doubt. He had feared what would come after the final ritual. He broke with his faith. He fled from what he was supposed to fulfill. And this mistake, made several lifetimes ago, created an imbalance that reverberates to this day. He then understood that the dreams, the unlikely journey, the reunion with the temple, all of it, had been guided by a greater force. It wasn't coincidence, it was destiny. And more than that, it was a mission. That spiritual cycle could not remain open. If it weren't closed with awareness and true repentance, the temple would be lost forever. And with it, all the ancient wisdom it had protected. Seeking guidance, The man spent nights reading the records of his great-great-grandfather, who kept books and notes on ancient Eastern religions and purification rituals. In one of the books, he found an underlined passage that read, "The temple lives as long as its flame lives. What the mind forgets, the soul preserves. But only true repentance rekindles the fire of truth." Based on this, he wrote his own ritual, combining the fragments of memory with the teachings he had managed to recover. He made a necklace from pieces of wood from the destroyed altar, brought offerings made from natural elements such as resin, flax, and salt, and redrew the circle on the temple's central floor, even though part of the floor was covered by weeds and cracks. As he entered the temple for the last time, alone and silent, he heard the sound of distant bells, the same ones from his dreams. And as he stood in the center, a breeze passed through the destroyed walls, as if the spirits were watching. He began to recite the words. He didn't know how he knew them. Words in an ancient language, laced with emotion, guilt, and a desire for reparation. The flame was rekindled. It was no ordinary fire, but a silent, bluish spark that illuminated the temple's interior like a whisper of peace. The bells rang, even without the wind, and the statues, now visible in the dim light, seemed to smile. He had fulfilled it. He had mended what had been broken. He had closed the cycle his own soul had left behind, and as he left the temple, he felt light, whole, as if a part of him had finally returned home. The silence inside the temple was dense, almost physical. After so many discoveries, the dreams, the face in the painting, the disturbing visions of the past, the protagonist understood that he had reached the point of no return. This was not just a forgotten ruin in the middle of a forest. It was a living sanctuary of memories and unresolved karma. He knew, deep in his soul, that something needed to be done, not for the temple, but for himself. Guided by flashes of previous visions, he walked to the ancient altar, where the painting of the priest himself seemed to be watching him. The structure, though corroded by time, still bore the marks of ancient symbols carved into the stone. With a mixture of reverence and unease, he knelt. In his hands, he carried the small objects he had collected from the ruins over the past few days. A broken bell, a still intact candle, and a deteriorated parchment bearing phrases in a language he had never studied, but now understood. Heart pounding, he rekindled the fire in the center of the altar with the candle. A faint but strangely blue flame appeared. As soon as it lit, winds began to blow through the temple's cracks, and a faint sound of bells echoed in the distance. He recited the words from the scroll softly, feeling each syllable vibrate in his chest as if awakening something ancient within him. During the ritual, the memories came flooding back. He saw himself in the past, wearing the priest's robes, before a spiritual council, breaking the pact with words of pride and fear, and he felt, once again, the beginning of his downfall. But this time, he knew what he needed to do: ask for forgiveness. Out loud, he acknowledged his guilt, his arrogance, and begged for the opportunity to restore the balance he had destroyed. The temple reacted. The altar flame grew, and a beam of light pierced the cracked ceiling, illuminating his own image on the wall. The leaves swayed around him as if the place were breathing. Then, in a final gesture, he touched his forehead to the floor and remained in absolute silence. At that moment, the bells rang out on their own, a clear, harmonious, and deep sound. For a moment, the temple seemed to wake up. The walls seemed more solid, the cracks disappeared for seconds, and the air felt light, as if the weight of centuries had been lifted. Opening his eyes, he saw a luminous figure before him, a reflection of the priest he once was, smiling silently before disappearing into the light of the altar. The ritual was complete, but the protagonist knew it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a cycle, now aligned with time and the forces he once dared to defy. He left the temple with tears in his eyes, but a light heart. Something inside him had changed forever. That morning felt different. The protagonist, exhausted after the previous night's intense ritual, left the temple feeling a strange, almost heavenly calm. Each step through the forest felt lighter, as if something inside him had been lifted, an ancient burden that no longer belonged to him. The air was cleaner, the sounds of nature clearer, and there was an inexplicable feeling that everything around him recognized him. Looking back one last time, he expected to see the temple, but there was nothing, only tall trees and absolute silence. Confused, he hurries back to the nearest village to report what he experienced. But when he asks about the temple, the locals seem to have no idea what he's talking about. Some even say nothing like it ever existed in that region. Others simply look away and change the subject. The uneasiness creeps back into his chest. Was it a delusion, an overly vivid dream? Or has the temple, now awake and redeemed, chosen to erase itself from the physical world entirely? Back home, days later, he decides to review all the notes he'd made about his dreams, the maps, the paths he'd taken, but he finds nothing. No paper, no photos, not even the journal where he'd recorded his visions. It's as if that part of his life has been carefully removed from tangible reality. Then, at dawn, a letter appears on his desk, unrecognized in an ancient envelope, sealed with a symbol he saw engraved on the temple's columns. His hands tremble as he opens it. The aged paper bears only a message written in gold ink. The cycle has closed, but other portals still await. You have been recognized. You have been remembered. Prepare yourself. The reading ends with a feeling of mingling fear and peace. This was not an end, but a point of passage. Its role as a conduit between worlds had been reactivated, and the temple, now part of the invisible, continued to exist, not as a ruin, but as energy. At the bottom of the letter, a small hand-drawn map, a new location, another forest, another symbol. He understands in that instant that his journey is just beginning. He had repaired an ancient spiritual flaw, but his soul seemed to have been chosen for something greater, a guardian of memories, a restorer of forgotten pacts. As he completes this stage, he finally understands the reason for the dreams, the visions, the calling. The longing he felt wasn't for the temple, but for himself, for a mission his soul had embraced many lifetimes ago. Now, awake, he walks toward the next portal, with the certainty that there are realities that reason can never explain, and what remains is to feel.